Today we'll cover the trans-theoretical model, or the TTM. The TTM originated in the early 1980s and was developed by two very famous scientists named Prochaska and DiClemente. The trans-theoretical model, as the name implies, is derived from multiple theories, and pieces of the different theories were put together. So that's where the name trans-theoretical model comes from. The underlying assumption of the TTM is that people change in incremental steps, and that change is not linear. So change occurs in a series of progress, revert, and that occurs in a cycle. The trans-theoretical model is based on 5 key assumptions. The first assumption is that no single theory can account for all of the complexities of behavior change. The authors of the TTM decided that at that time, so in 1983, there was no one theory that could possibly explain behavior. And so they decided to take pieces from different theories and put them together into the trans-theoretical model. The second key assumption is that behavior change unfolds over time through a sequence of stages. And that is why this theory is a stage theory. The third assumption is that stages are both stable and open to change. What this means is that individuals could very well stay in one stage for decades, for years and years, and not make any changes through the stages. Or at any given time, an individual could move through the stages either forwards or backwards. So they could make progress, or they could move to an earlier stage and move further away from behavior change. The fourth assumption is that most populations who are at risk for a particular health issue are not prepared for action, and therefore they will not be served by traditional action-oriented behavior change programs. What this means is that most theories, and all of the theories that we've talked about to date, assume that if individuals change on different constructs, so for example, in the health belief model, if you changed a person's perceived susceptibility, perceived severity, their self-efficacy, and so on, they would change and they'd be ready to do so at any given time. Well, the TTM poses a counter argument to that, saying that most people are not ready, and behavior change is not so simple as one particular formula that you can just piece together an intervention based on and then people will change. The fifth and final assumption of the TTM is that specific processes and principles of change should be used at different stages of change to maximize efficacy. And you'll see what that means in greater detail in a couple of slides, but essentially this means that there are particular strategies or techniques that work to move individuals from one stage to another, and different strategies may work depending on the stage that the person is in. So the same strategy might not work for somebody who's in stage 1 as it does for somebody who's in stage 4. There are 5 constructs in the trans-theoretical model. The first construct is stages of change, and this is why some people call this model the stages of change model, but really this is only one of the 5 constructs. And oftentimes you will see, in fact, more often than not, when you're reading about interventions that use the trans-theoretical model, they exclusively use the stages of change and then say that they use the trans-theoretical model, but they entirely abandon the other constructs. And so that's not necessarily an appropriate use of this theory because there are a number of other constructs. The stages of change. Here are the stages of change. And the stages of change are a continuum that go from furthest away from making a behavior change to closest to making a behavior change, or actually making a behavior change. So starting from the bottom, we have pre-contemplation. Now, pre-contemplation could include 2 different types of people. It can include people who have no idea that they need to make a change. They're doing something that could affect their health, and they have no idea that they need to stop. An example of this could be somebody who has no idea that they're eating too much sugar and putting themselves at risk for diabetes. The other type of person that's in the pre-contemplation stage is somebody that knows full well that what they're doing is unhealthy, but they have no intention of changing ever, at least not in the near future. So these could be people who've maybe repeatedly tried to change in the past and failed, and now they've lost all hope or given up and are not going to try to change again. The next stage is the contemplation stage. So these are people who know that they need to make a change, and they're thinking about it. They're thinking about making a change within the next 6 months or so. The next phase or stage is the preparation stage. And these are people who have decided that they are going to make a change. They're going to eat less sugar, or they're going to exercise, and they're actively planning to make that change within the next 30 days. So maybe they've started downloading healthy recipes from the internet, or they've joined a gym, or they've looked up support groups for an addiction. Whatever it is, they have made concrete steps towards making a change, but they haven't actually tried to change their behavior yet. Next, we get to the action phase. So this is when people are starting to make that behavior change. They're cooking healthier, they're exercising, they've stopped smoking, whatever it is, they've started to make that change. And they're in the early stages. The first 6 months of a new behavior change is considered the action stage. So here we have an arrow to something that's not a stage, but something that happens, which is relapse. So we spoke earlier about how the basis of this theory is the understanding that people change and then they revert, and they make progress and then they revert. And here this figure indicates where that happens most often. So most often when somebody has just started making a behavior change, but it's not yet part of their routine, they relapse. And it depends on the person and the situation. They could relapse all the way back to pre-contemplation, or they could go to contemplation or preparation. But unfortunately, this often happens. If somebody doesn't relapse and they make it through the action stage and their behavior has changed for 6 months or longer, they are considered in the maintenance stage. So this is a period where their behavior is considered part of their routine. You don't have to think about it too much anymore. The temptation to revert is still there. So somebody could still relapse when they're in the maintenance phase. However, once somebody gets past the maintenance stage, they are considered to be in the termination stage. And this is kind of controversial. The definition of the termination stage is that an individual no longer has any temptation to relapse. So when you hear that, you probably think, I don't know how realistic that is. When is there a situation when somebody has no temptation at all to relapse? And it's true that maybe that's kind of a far-fetched idea, but there are millions of success stories about people who have changed a behavior for the long term. So they've quit smoking, or they reduced their sugar intake, or adopted some sort of healthy behavior, and they've maintained it for decades and decades. So even if they are still tempted to eat that extra cookie or to smoke, they are considered in the termination phase. Let's talk about how we actually use the stages of change in research. There's a couple of different ways that you can classify individuals into a stage of change. The easiest way is through a series of questions like this that you can administer either through a questionnaire or an interview. So this is an example of a drug abuse intervention. You would ask individuals, do you currently abuse drugs? If they say yes, they are a potential participant for your intervention. So next you would ask them, do you intend to stop using in the next 30 days? If they say yes, this means they're already in the preparation phase. If they say no, then you need to dig a little deeper and ask them, do you intend to stop in the next 6 months? If they say no, that means they're in the pre-contemplation stage. They have no intention of changing in the near future. But if they say yes, that means they're in the contemplation stage and need to be nudged a little bit further towards making that behavior change. So what we do from here is we decide, depending on the resources that we have in our intervention, we decide if there's a particular group of individuals, so a particular stage that we want to target. And how we make this decision is dependent on a couple of different factors. The first and probably the best reason to make a decision is the expertise of your group. So if you are a group of clinical psychologists with addiction expertise, then you are likely best equipped to handle people in the preparation or even the action phase, which is not indicated here on this graph, because you can provide people with treatment right then and there. In contrast, if you are part of a health promotion organization where your goal and your expertise is in inspiring individuals to seek help and getting them to that point, then you may decide to invest your resources designing a health promotion program for individuals in the pre-contemplation or the contemplation stage. And ultimately, the reason why we stage people and why we would make decisions like that is because we want to use our resources in the most efficient way. And if we didn't stage people, so if we didn't see how ready they were to change, and we created one intervention strategy, you can imagine that that intervention strategy would not work for all of the people. If we got 100 people in the room and we didn't assess what stage they were, we gave them all the same intervention, the chances are that quite a few of those people are in the pre-contemplation or contemplation stage, and what would work for them is not what would work for the preparation phase, and vice versa. So ultimately, the key benefit to using a stage theory is the ability to parse out particular subgroups of the population that are in need of an intervention, and then develop an intervention that is very specifically tailored to those people. And that increases the chances of success in your intervention. So you can develop something that is very specific to a very specific group of people.